Department urged the authorities in Bahrain to show restraint.
This is a second situation where security forces have responded aggressively to protesters, and there's been an unacceptable loss of life.
Still, as the Middle East continues to swell with protest and its political landscape shifts, cracks in U.S. foreign policy in the region are being further exposed. Despite its military base in Bahrain, the White House seems to be having little influence in stemming the violence there.
U.S. policy in the region is basically being made on an ad hoc basis, and I think that makes it very difficult. I think the White House is scrambling, and they obviously have to consult with a lot of their allies, particularly in the Gulf, because as opposed to Egypt, we're now in a place of very, very great strategic significance for the United States.
The Obama administration finds itself in a tough spot once again as it tries to balance calls for political reform from states like Libya, Yemen, and Bahrain, while still managing its own geostrategic interests in those countries. Kimberly Helkett, AlJazeera, Washington.
In Iran, thousands of government supporters have gathered to call for the execution of opposition leaders following last week's anti-government rallies. During Friday prayers, a senior cleric said the opposition had lost its reputation among the people. He called for restrictions on opposition leaders Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hossein Mousavi to prevent them from communicating with their supporters. The Iraqi government has imposed a curfew in some parts of the country, and that's in response to angry protests. In Basra, in the south, the protesters blocked a bridge. They're calling for the provincial governor to quit, and they're demanding better services and jobs. Meanwhile, in the city of Kut, protests ended with some demonstrators storming regional government headquarters. At least one teenager was killed in the clashes that followed, and the city does remain under curfew. France has kicked off its presidency of the G20 group of nations with a warning from President Nicolas Sarkozy. He says national interests must be put to one side, and that's if the organization is to succeed. Sarkozy went on to remind the gathered ministers of the challenges that are facing them. Well, they're embarking on a weekend of negotiations over the so-called indicative guidelines, and these are aimed at signaling imbalances that could threaten individual economies and global stability.
Since last year, the recovery has begun. It's faster than foreseen, but it's unequal. It's not sufficient enough to bring unemployment rates down. Coordination is, and we have to understand this, the only way we will be able to tackle unemployment. It's our only hope. There's no alternative choice.
But China appears to be ignoring Sarkozy's call. It's rejected plans to use real exchange rates as well as currency reserves to measure global economic imbalances, and that cast doubt over the ability of the G20 members to reach agreement during their two-day meeting. The U.S. Secretary of State has called on Pakistan to stop encouraging anti-American sentiment. Hillary Clinton's remarks come amid anger in Lahore over the killing of 2 Pakistanis by a U.S. embassy employee. Raymond Davis says that he acted in self-defense when he shot the men last month. The United States believes he has diplomatic immunity and is putting pressure on Pakistan to release him. At least 12 people are reported dead after a shootout between 2 rival drug gangs in the Mexican city of Acapulco. The gunfire erupted as one group attacked taxi drivers associated with another gang. 6 cars were incinerated, and 2 of the victims are said to have burned to death in their vehicles. The 2 gangs were reportedly battling for control of the local drug market, and another 4 men were thrown to their deaths off a bridge with their hands and feet tied. Mexican authorities have arrested a man suspected of killing at least 20 people in and around the capital since the start of the year. Juan Carlos Vasconcelos Montalvo, known as the gray-haired one, is also accused of smuggling drugs. Authorities say that he worked for the La Familia drug gang. In Bolivia, protesters have marched for a 4th straight day against rising food and transportation costs. Public support for President Evo Morales has plummeted after he tried to lift subsidies on gasoline, sugar, and flour in December. The Japanese whaling fleet is heading home. That's after its annual whale hunt was cut short by almost a month. The government says it's because of harassment by the anti-whaling group Sea Shepherd. Here's Veronica Pedrosa.
With light beams and smoke canisters, Japan's whaling season comes to an abrupt halt. And now it's official.
For the safety of our fleet, we regret that we have to end the whale hunting survey.
The whaling boats had already suspended the hunt, turned around and headed home after being hounded by a hard-line anti-whaling group. Boats from the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society had been chasing the leading ship, throwing flares and stink bombs.
It's regretful that these disruptive activities took place. So from our point of view, we would like to make sure such things don't happen in the future.
The Japanese boats are allowed to hunt for what they say are scientific purposes. But critics point out the whale meat not used for study is sold for people to eat in Japan. So they say the real reason is profit.
The key here is an economic one. We have to sink the Japanese whaling fleet economically. We have to bankrupt them. And after 6 years, that's exactly what's happening. We come down here every year stronger. They come down here every year weaker. And we're going to drive them out of the sanctuary.
Japan's decision to end the whaling season early's already been welcomed by another government.
In the view of the Australian government, it's not time to celebrate until we get a decision from Japan that they are stopping whaling for good.
And there's a potentially greater threat to the whalers. They're subsidised by the Japanese government, but they've only killed about a fifth of their quota. Having ended the season early, they reportedly stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Veronica Pedrosa, AlJazeera.
The headlines for you on Al Jazeera. At least 70 people are thought to have been killed during demonstrations across Libya, and security forces in the city of Benghazi and many other towns in the eastern part of the country have left the streets. The people are calling for leader Muammar Gaddafi to step down. Security remains tight in Bahrain's capital after shots were fired at anti-government protesters on Friday. The wounded were then taken to the city's main Salmaniya hospital, where protesters have gathered outside, defying a ban on demonstrations. The country's crown prince has called for calm.
I say calm down to the person who throws stones and to the person who shoots bullets. This doesn't serve anybody.
Do you want to withdraw the security forces from the street?
We are talking, the security forces, we are talking about controlling the situation. We cannot really do impulsive decision at this moment.
The United States has vetoed a UN resolution to brand Israeli settlements illegal. The resolution had received backing from 14 out of 15 members, but was defeated. Instead, Washington has offered to support a weaker, non-binding presidential statement that rejects the legitimacy of Israel's settlements. It's prompted angry Palestinians to vow to reevaluate the entire Middle